Oh, hello. This is the age-old question, right? Like, how much is enough? So I just want to start this conversation by saying that we've got a panel of experts here. Medical doctors, clinicians that actually have a ton of experience dosing. And so I think we're going to have a lot of super valuable information here. And I also want to start by kind of turning the dosing model on its head, because one of the things that we've learned to do in medical schools and FNP schools and whatnot is pharmacological dosing. So I want to talk about pharmacological dosing versus physiological dosing. And this may be new to some of you, but the idea of physiological dosing is using the amount, the least amount to get the effect you want. Now you can imagine quickly that this is labor intensive. It's labor intensive for the patient, and it's labor intensive for the clinician because they have to follow it. But it's a good model of dosing, and if we followed a model like that, we would actually have a medical system that didn't kill 80 to 100,000 people a year based on properly prescribed pharmaceuticals. And that is a real number by the year. So what we'll do here is, let me quickly say hello to everybody. Hi. You've got on the end, you've got Karen MacCallum, Dr. Karen MacCallum. You've got Dr. Michelle Shuffett, and you've got Dr. Bonni Goldstein. You've got Dr. Dustin Sulak, and then I'm Dr. Kevin Spelman. But not that kind of doctor, but another kind of doctor. And what we'll do here, part one, we'll jump into, and I'm sorry for the popping. Part one, we'll jump into some slides, and then part two, we'll actually have a robust discussion based on what's the right amount. So, and Michelle, I think you're up first.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you everyone for coming out this afternoon. My name is Michelle Shuffett, and I work with Columbia Care. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Columbia Care, but they're a medical cannabis manufacturer. They create and sell precision-formulated, unit-dosed medical cannabis products. And what do I mean by that? It's basically like a pharmaceutical product. Each dose tells you exactly how many milligrams you're going to get in a particular tablet, tincture, vaporization, that sort of thing. And it really helps patients because it allows them to be able to titrate the products in a safe and effective way. We're licensed to operate in 15 different jurisdictions in the US and the EU. And I'm going to talk mostly about New York. We are bringing precision formulated products to California later this fall. But the data that we're going to talk about today is from our New York database. So since we started in New York, we've delivered almost 12 million doses of medical cannabis to patients. And the database we're looking at today is what we call the impact database. And this kind of moves around here. I'm gonna talk a little bit about our general population, and then also talk about a cohort of older versus younger. And if you were here before for the previous presentation, I think Eloise did a fabulous job talking about some of the special needs in the elderly population and the reasons why medical cannabis is super important for that particular group. So let's jump right in with the general population in New York. The way the rules work in New York is you have to have a qualifying condition and then also an associated condition or symptom. And the number one condition in New York, as you might imagine, is chronic pain. About 50% of patients have that listed on their certification. Number two is neuropathy, and number three is cancer. The average age is 53.5, and we're actually pretty equally balanced with about half female, half male. Now let's look at the dosing that these patients get. So to kind of set you up from a dosing perspective, we have THC on the left-hand side of the slide, and we have CBD on the right-hand side of the slide. And the way we look at the dose is we look at the patient's first invoice versus their most recent invoice. And we compare that over time. So we have it divided up in quartiles, and we also have a median and a mean value. And if you start with the THC side, what you'll see, and I don't think this would surprise anyone in the room, is that the THC dose gradually goes up over time between the first and most recent invoice. Whereas the CBD dose on the right-hand side, you'll see that that trends downward with the first versus most recent invoice. And if we look at the averages, the mean THC daily dose for that patient population is about 31 milligrams, and the mean CBD dose for that population is about 14 milligrams. So now we'll switch and we'll talk about that younger versus older cohort. And again, Eloise explained it very eloquently. We know that 80% of the elderly population has multiple chronic conditions. They take multiple medications. Their healthcare is extremely costly, complicated, and it impacts their quality of life. And we look at medical cannabis as a safe and effective alternative for these patients. And we wanted to understand if there were any considerations based on the information we have within that patient population. So we decided to split it up as 45 and under being younger, 70 plus being older. The 45 and under group was about 50% female, and the top 3 conditions were chronic pain, neuropathy, and IBD. With the older population, it was a little bit more skewed towards the female side, almost 60%. Top 3 conditions were chronic pain, neuropathy, and cancer. So the difference was kind of in just number 3 there. But you'll notice that the 70 plus group had a higher percentage of neuropathy overall, and I think that's important when we look at the different doses. So this time we're going to have just THC on the slide. We have the younger group on the left, we have the older group on the right, and you see the same trend. The dose goes up first versus most recent invoice, and the median dose in that elderly population is lower than the younger population, 10.5 versus 16.9, as you might imagine. When we dose these patients, we're very careful to start the elderly population on the smallest possible dose of THC for all the reasons that we know very well. We don't want to have a fall, we don't want to have disorientation or confusion. If we look at the CBD side, again, you see the same exact trend as we saw with the general population. The doses go down over time, and the median dose for the elderly, 7.2, and for the adult population, or the younger population, 4.6 milligrams. And again, I think this is probably related to the fact that these patients had more neuropathy, and what we've found in our experience with the patients in New York is that the higher CBD doses work best for patients with neuropathy. So what about adverse effects and satisfaction with therapy? Before I jump into that, I want you to understand a little bit more about our different product formulations. They're set up into basically 3 categories in the formulated products. We have Theraseed, which is a high THC product, Elaseed, which is equal, and Claraseed, which is a higher CBD product. And the ratios are 20-to-1 in either direction, or 1-to-1 for the middle group. And if you look at the elderly population, they took about the same of each of those 3 types of products. Maybe a little bit more Theraseed, but not too much. I think it was a couple percentage points higher. Whereas the younger population took almost twice as much Theraseed as they did the other 2 formulated products. But the thing that we found most interesting and we were most excited to see is that the satisfaction with therapy was exactly the same across both groups. They were taking the medication in a dose that was appropriate, and they felt like they were getting relief from their symptomatology. It was also safe, with the most common adverse event being increased appetite, and that was seen in 25% of patients, regardless of whether they were elderly or on the younger side. And I think the most important point on this slide is only 6% of the patients that were 70 plus reported any confusion or disorientation. So to recap, the most common qualifying conditions, chronic pain, neuropathy, and cancer. And in our general population, we see that trend up in THC, a trend down in CBD over time. And we implore what I call a functional dosing strategy, which I think is what you were getting at earlier, where we always start patients on the lowest possible dose and titrate them up slowly. And the idea is to, as you know, find the smallest amount that works without impairing them in any form or fashion. These products are safe and effective in the elderly population, and we believe that the higher CBD is due to the fact that the elderly population tends to have more neuropathy from a qualifying condition perspective. Last but not least, it's really exciting to have some actual data to back up the idea that medical cannabis could be a safe and effective alternative for these patients, and it might even move into a first-line position and replace over-the-counter medications, because it quite frankly has a better safety profile than most of those over-the-counter medications and other medications that the elderly population have to take. Thank you.
Excellent presentation and real data. Fantastic. Thank you, Michelle. Dr. Sulak?
Thanks. All right, everyone. How many people were not in this room yesterday? Okay, so maybe about half. This is just a little review from some slides that we had yesterday. The essentials of what I think are important about cannabis dosing that make it different from other medications. So we'll just dive right in. First of all, cannabis has an extraordinarily broad, safe, and effective dosing range. You don't see many medications where you can have a 500 or a 5,000-fold safe and effective dosing range. But literally, these are the doses, including the outliers, that I've seen effective in my practice. And that means someone my size might need 1 milligram of cannabinoids per day to help a condition, or they might do well with 3,500 milligrams per day, or maybe even more. And I've seen people at 3,500 with no side effects, feeling great, no psychoactivity, no impairment, even if it's almost all THC. Yet researchers have really tried to kill animals with THC, and even at doses several orders of magnitude higher than what I'm seeing in my practice, they've failed to do so. It's really impressive how safe this medicine is. So really broad dosing range. And then within this broad dosing range, there are non-linear dose response effects and different phases. So this is an example of a biphasic dose response, where in the first phase, as you increase the dose, the effect gets stronger, but in the second phase, as you increase the dose, the effect gets weaker. This is mostly due to tolerance building, but you'll notice that there's an optimal dose there in the middle. The optimal dose is unique for each person, and it can change at different stages of their life and different stages of their healing. It can be a bit of a moving target, but when someone's at the optimal dose, they do not build tolerance, they retain efficacy and can do so for years or even decades with great results. So that's important. And this shows up in the animal literature. This is an example of locomotor activity in rats. If you, the black bar or the dark bar is their baseline locomotor activity level. If you give them a tiny dose of THC, the activity goes down. As you increase the dose, the activity goes up. As you increase the dose even more, the activity goes back down again. And you can see the emergence of something called catalepsy after that peak dose there. Catalepsy means remaining still in an unusual position. It's analogous to what we call couch lock in people. And if the goal here was to reduce activity, maybe a similar goal to reducing spasticity or anxiety or something like that, then you can see we would actually do better using that very tiny dose, 0.2 milligrams per kilogram, compared to the higher dose. So less can be more with cannabis. It very often is, but not always. Here's another example of less is more. People with cancer, chronic pain, treated with opioids, started off on nabiximols, which is a 1-to-1 oral spray of CBD and THC, and you can see the group that got 20 milligrams per day did better than the group that got 50 and 83 milligrams per day. Less is more. And I'll hold back on the placebo conversation because we're short on time, but it's a good one. And CBD also has biphasic dose-response effects. A lot of people don't observe this clinically because their patients can't afford the high doses that are often required to demonstrate this effect. But here's one example of a study on anxiety that showed that 300 milligrams work better than 900 milligrams and better than 100 milligrams. There's a sweet spot with these cannabinoids, and I think as we design and perform clinical trials, this has to be taken into account, that it's not a one-size-fits-all dosing. We need pragmatic dosing approaches. I already told you guys this morning about how tiny bits of THC can do things in mice that are quite surprising. Here's just the other two references that I mentioned this morning. Protect the brain, protect the heart, protect the liver. And CBDA, microgram antiemetic activity. I didn't get a chance to mention this this morning, but you'll notice the scale on the x-axis is micrograms per kilogram. Half a microgram per kilogram of CBDA in a rat, I believe, was enough to reduce nausea. That is such a small dose. Even for a rat, that's an incredibly small dose. CBDA seems to be ultra potent. You probably don't need a lot of it to go a long way. And it mimics many of CBD's actions, except it does not downregulate the CB1 receptor. So unlike CBD, which is a negative allosteric modulator at that receptor and can counteract some of the effects of THC, CBDA would act a lot more like CBD, but without that anti-THC aspect, which for some patients they want the THC and the CBD, and for some people they want the full strength of THC to shine through and not be limited by the CBD, yet they want to get the other benefits. CBDA is a great candidate for that. With THC, interestingly, when I started my practice, there was no CBD around. We were treating everyone with THC. We didn't know how potent their formulas were. That didn't stop us from getting great results. I learned that there's almost always a therapeutic window with THC, which means, say, this is the dose needed to treat pain. This is the dose that gets people too stoned to be comfortable and functional. And you can get inside that window with precision dosing, and there's some strategies for widening that therapeutic window. In fact, just starting low and going slow widens the therapeutic window, as you can see on the slide, because of heterogeneous tolerance building in different brain regions to the effects of THC, make it so that we're more likely to retain efficacy of the symptom relief or therapeutic qualities while we build tolerance to the side effects. And that informs dosing strategies that I have online at healer.com, which you guys can check out. There's also many bidirectional effects in cannabis, meaning it can do one thing or it can do the opposite. I think THC overdose is the best example of that, which is characterized by nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, twitching, muscle spasms, pain, confusion, anxiety. At the right dose of THC, it can treat all of those things. At the wrong dose, it can cause all of those things. And I just need to say one last thing here about dosing. Out of my great respect to Caroline MacCallum and her co-author Ethan Russo, who wrote a great paper on dosing in which they warmly acknowledged me. But there's just a saying in that paper that I think the wording needs a little bit of tweaking, if I may, and it's been quoted in other research I've seen. It's start low, go slow, and stay low. When actually the real saying is, in my opinion, from what I learned and in my practice, is start low, go slow, and don't be afraid to go all the way. That's really what it comes down to, because some people do well on extraordinarily high doses. We don't know that until we try, but don't stay low. If someone's not responding to a low dose, please titrate up to thousands of milligrams if they need it, and if they can afford it, sometimes that works as well. Thank you.
So two really prominent things come out of this. Number one is the idea of hormesis. Dr. Sulak called it biphasic, also known as hormetic. And these hormetic effects are classic throughout all the biological kingdom with almost every substance. So keep in mind, if you're a clinician and you don't know about biphasic dosing or hormesis, look it up, because it's really rather profound. The other thing that comes out, and by the way, until about 1940, when the homeopaths jumped on the idea of hormesis, which is this idea that a low dose could have an effect, but a high dose could be toxic. There were multiple journals with the theme of hormesis. When the homeopaths jumped on board to that to try to explain scientifically why their stuff worked, all the journals went out of business within about 3 or 4 years. That's science being killed by politics. Now, the other thing that Dr. Sulak brought up rather well is inter-individual variability. And I think most of us know in this room at this point that the degree of inter-individual variability in the endocannabinoid system is really rather profound. So let's keep that in mind, and let's hand it over to Dr. MacCallum.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here, and we're having such a lovely discussion. I'm sure there's going to be some overlap. Just want to mention before I get going, I've got my Twitter handle on the screen here, and there's a number of us in the audience that are quite active, and Bonnie's got a great Instagram page and trying to get others involved, Dustin and Tom Folan, and just to really get the conversation going and the movement that we need to have about having good evidence out there and talking rationally about this medicine. So just a couple disclosures. I work with a number of different groups. Some of them are cannabis-related groups. Some of them are nonprofits. So just to mention those disclosures before I get started. Dr. Russo and myself, we wrote this paper, as Dustin kindly pointed out, and I'd love to have a chat about that in the Q&A, because I think that's a really great point, what you've mentioned, and it might need some qualifiers, but just enough to say that we really do need to have good clinical practice when we're working with cannabis and be discerning that it isn't for everyone, and we need to make sure that we're screening our patients appropriately. So just some questions. I know we're talking about dosing here, but I just have to mention these things before I dive into the dosing. These are questions that I frequently ask myself before I authorize cannabis for a patient. So is there supporting evidence for this patient? And if there isn't, let's have a conversation about it. Let's weigh the pros and cons with this medication, just like every other medication we do in medicine. Has this patient tried other things? It is kind of worth documenting if they had, especially for medical legal purposes, honestly. So I like to write this down if I can. And then what are the patient's expectations? And talking about placebo effect and other topics of this nature I think are important. Does this patient have any reasons why we wouldn't use cannabis? Being very mindful of schizophrenia and other conditions, we need to be careful. With THC, it doesn't mean we can't use it, but having a discussion around that. And then what are the patient's risks for cannabis use disorder? What are the benefits versus the risk, like I mentioned? And how do we actually dose cannabis, which is what we're going to dive into. And also considering when we can taper other medications once we're seeing symptom improvement. So again, this is the paper, and it's available for free for download. It's also on my website, so please check it out. And just to touch a little bit on routes of administration, because when we're talking about a dose and we're talking about milligrams, that's really an edible that we're frequently referring to. But then when you're inhaling cannabis, the dose can be a little bit more complicated. So in the interest of time, I won't go through all of these different routes, but just enough to say there are pros and cons to different routes we will use. If it's an acute symptom, we're going to want to inhale cannabis probably. If it's a chronic symptom, oils can be more helpful. And being mindful of vaporization, and Dustin speaks a lot to this point as well. So first talking about how we can use cannabis in an inhaled format using the lowest dose possible to get benefit. So again, possibly increasing the dose until we see that response. So again, starting with one inhalation and waiting 10 minutes and checking out how you feel and what symptoms are going on for you, and then increasing from there. And then when you add up all those inhalations, that may become your baseline dose. However, that dose can change for different products. So if you have a 20% THC product, that's going to have a different number of inhalations than a 10%. So just keeping that in mind. And also, if you go on vacation and stop using cannabis and restart, again, with THC, you may need to go back down to a lower previous dose, just in case you've lost some of your tolerance there. And so basically, really just being mindful of how you use it. And especially with the vaporizer, I find it easier for patients to put a small amount in and to add more if they need it, versus rolling a joint. Frequently, people will smoke the whole joint when they may not really need it all, depending on their dose. And just to mention the entourage effect, so this has been Dr. Russo is very big into this, so it is a thing, and it's important to be mindful that CBD, in addition to THC, can allow us to go to a higher dose of THC than might have been previously tolerated. So here's some doses that I just mentioned that I'm drawing from the paper again, starting with about 5 milligrams to 10 milligrams twice a day for CBD. I find that to be effective for my patients. I have actually very few patients that do go a whole lot higher than 50 to 100 milligrams, but I don't see as much oncology, and there are some other subcategories such as seizures and so forth that may require higher doses. So again, I think that it's really interesting, this biphasic discussion, and we really don't know each person, like each individual, how they will respond and what dose would be helpful for them. But again, the higher you go, the more costly this medication can be. So be mindful, and having a patient record their outcomes is really helpful, because they may hit a point where they're spending more money and they're getting no more benefit. So really getting them to check in on that. And then for THC, I usually start around 1 milligram to 2.5 milligrams. I always start at bedtime if they have any issues with sleep, especially because then we can use it as a 2-for-1. I have a number of patients that I actually help them sleep, and in the daytime they don't need any cannabis. And I think that this is a really opportune window to use THC, because if they're driving a car, or they've got kids and they don't want to be under the influence of THC, even a low dose, it would be great if we didn't have to go there. So again, optimizing for THCA, CBDA, and other cannabinoids I think could be very helpful. And so just some general dosing tips. These are kind of a little bit more specific and maybe a bit more advanced depending on the conversation. But a lot of the times these are points that I go over with different individuals depending on what their experience of cannabis has already been. So basically, patients get tolerance to the side effects of cannabis, and in my experience, they don't necessarily get tolerance to the benefits. So what I mean by that is, I know that we just heard from the first talk that the dose was increasing and over time with THC, but most of my patients actually plateau out at a certain dose and they're not increasing indefinitely. Something they do report is having to rotate a strain, so they may feel like it may not be working quite as well, but if they try a different flower that may have a similar concentration or percentage, that they do find it can help them kind of bridge that gap so that they aren't increasing the dosing. But again, this requires a lot of education and making sure the patient isn't just on their own increasing up to 5 grams a day or 10 grams a day, where I have seen that in some cases. And from our studies, especially Dr. Ware, who's one of our Canadian experts, 1 to 3 grams a day of dried product is largely what the medical cannabis patients were using in his study. And over 90% of patients will only use between 0.5 and 1.5 grams for medical purposes, so keeping that in mind. So it's also important to mention there's terpenes and other minor cannabinoids that can definitely make a difference. I've had some patients try 20 different plants, and it may be the 18th or the 20th that do help them with different symptoms. So those patients are quite persistent and adamant, but at some point we do just need to make sure that they're actually getting the outcomes that they're looking for. I don't ever recommend shatter or dabs for medical purposes, and even for recreational purposes. I think we need to be very mindful, especially with some of the health concerns that are coming out, and especially with unregulated products. And being mindful also of tolerance, there is an opportunity to consider a washout for some patients, and that may be appropriate. And CBD can help us wash out a patient when they are getting up to a higher dose of THC where they may not be comfortable. So keeping this in mind. And then also mentioning there are some of these low risk use guidelines that I think are notable, and a lot of them make a lot of sense. Starting low, avoiding high percentages if we don't need it, which I don't totally agree. I think that there's some math here that they're not understanding. You just use less of a more concentrated product. It doesn't mean you can't use a higher percentage product. And being careful of age of onset and frequency of use if not necessary. And then monitoring, important just to say that it does need to happen. It's important, if possible, to capture questionnaire data. So anxiety, depression, pain, if you're able to get questionnaire data from your patients, it can be very useful, both for you and for them. But really focusing on their function. Are they able to walk to the mailbox? Are they able to hold their child? Sometimes the numbers don't change, but they are living better and they do feel that their quality of life has improved. So I definitely think that that's important to note. And there are some apps out there that can be really helpful with this as well. So in my last minute, there are some dosing strategies that, just to summarize here on this slide, so sometimes using oil over vaporization can be more helpful for chronic conditions, considering CBD over THC, really doing a good job on education, switching from smoking to vaporization, I have here using the lowest dose of THC, but that is working for them, and not focusing on percentages and so forth. And then the last 2 slides, so this is my overall, I guess, my approach to how I treat a patient. The first question I ask, is it daytime or nighttime symptom? Why would I treat the day if I can really get away with nighttime only? So sometimes that would mean obviously THC at night, CBD for the daytime a lot of the time, especially for my patients who are driving and working. They don't necessarily always feel comfortable using THC. Is it an acute symptom or a chronic symptom? If it's acute, vaporization, as I've mentioned. The pathophysiology, if it's largely inflammation, CBD may be a really good option for them. There are a couple of exceptions to the neurological point that I've made here. If they have psychosis, for example, or in pediatrics, I may just be more mindful of using THC for a neurological condition. However, I definitely do use THC in these patients, but trying to optimize CBD potentially first. And then special populations. So the elderly, I have patients with Parkinson's that have blood pressures, resting blood pressures of 70/40, and so they can be very sensitive to THC. So I frequently start lower with them. And then the last piece here, I try not to do any drug, other prescription changes when I initiate cannabis, because there's just too many things going on and it's hard to tease out what the side effect could be due to. So I like to help them feel better first and then pull away from their prescription medications. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so there you have it, straight out of the doctor's mouth. One of the things I want to put forward, how many people are here from industry? Okay, so here's, and many of you may be aware of this already, but there are people out there suggesting that the dosing that is on CBD products, which, well, let me just talk about a recent review that just came out, a 2019 review came out. It basically said anything under about 100 milligrams of CBD a day wasn't really doing much. So those of you from industry, obviously, we're seeing doses like 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams a couple times a day. And so you've got people on the science side saying it's placebo, which I would say is possible. Look, you need mystique to have placebo. You need reputation to have placebo. You've got both of those, right? And you need price, value to have placebo. You've got all three of those. So definitely there is probably some placebo going on. Now, I may get some tomatoes thrown at me, but there's almost certainly some placebo going on. When you're taking something that's got such a reputation around it, and it was expensive, right? And it's mystical because it comes from this forbidden plant, there's definitely going to be that effect. However, having said that, you've just heard from a couple of docs here that say that 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams, average mean dose of 14 milligrams, I think, of CBD actually does something. So I'd like to just throw it out to our panel here to comment on that.
So I mostly work with children, but I've also worked with adults now for 11 years. And what I find is that there is no number. It can be as low as 4 milligrams or as high as 400. And I'll just share with you 2 clinical experiences I had. One little boy was taking 4 milligrams when they came to see me. The parents had already started. And when they told me it was 4 milligrams, I kind of looked askew, and this is a little boy with autism. But the teacher, who did not know he was on that 4 milligrams before he came in, actually pulled the mother aside and commented, "What are you giving your child? Because he's a completely different child." And when they came to see me, I thought 4 milligrams, I don't give anybody 4 milligrams, it's such a low dose, but usually I'm taking care of very ill people who need much higher doses. And so I said, well, why don't we just titrate up and see if there's any more benefit, because they were already seeing more benefits at 4. He did not tolerate 7 milligrams or 10 milligrams. It actually gave him an opposite effect. So for that particular child, it was very effective at a very small dose, which is great. It won't cost them a fortune. That's terrific. I don't think that's placebo, because that little boy did not know what he was getting. On the other hand, I had another little boy that came in with severe aggression, self-injurious behavior, biting the parents. The dad showed me pictures of all the bruises on everybody's bodies. And this little boy, they had started off giving him, prior to coming to see me, because they had been waiting a little while for the appointment, they started with CBD, and they went up to about 100 milligrams, didn't see anything. Then they gave THCA, ran it up, they didn't see anything. They gave him THC. I told this story yesterday. They gave him up to 15 milligrams. They had heard that was a high dose, and so they didn't want to give any more, but it didn't do anything for him. And by the way, the dad thought the bottle was bad, so he took 15 milligrams and slept for 2 days. So wasn't the bottle. And it turned out that this little boy needed 400 milligrams twice a day of CBD in order to help his autism, and his aggression was gone at 400 milligrams twice a day. That's very expensive, but notice that here I have 2 kids, 4 milligrams, 400 milligrams, the same checkbox for diagnosis. So there's just a very wide range. And what I tell families is if you don't see anything, as long as it's not negative, if you see no change, you haven't found the dose yet, right? You have to escalate. And a lot of people don't want to do that on their own, and I do highly recommend that all children are medically supervised during this. But if you see a negative effect, then obviously you maybe have gone too high, and maybe that is not the right chemovar, the right product, the right strain, and maybe try something else within that realm.
Super. So you have a really excellent example here. Actually, I've heard a couple, but that was a great example of physiological dosing, right? Finding that dose. Imagine if we did that with all of the drugs. Anybody else comment on that? Michelle? Dr. Shuffett, excuse me.
To add to that point about the dosing being incredibly personal, one of the other things we've found in our database is that we have a group of patients that have extremely high daily dose requirements and another group that is extremely low. They have the same qualifying conditions, and they have, based on the surveys we give them, the same satisfaction with therapy. So one of the things we're doing right now is trying to understand the metabolic pathways and the metabolism associated with that to see if there's certain isoforms in the CYP450 system and all those other pharmacologic pathways that might give us a little anxiety from education a long time ago, but to try to understand if that metabolism is significantly different, and can we use that information to predict that starting dose? Because if we can, then we can save these patients money in the long run by being able to start them on the right dose, or at least closer to that right dose from the beginning.
Anybody else?
I'm going to add one more thing.
Yeah.
So one last thing to add. In Israel, they're doing some clinical trials on children with autism. They're also measuring anandamide levels, endocannabinoid levels in these children, and there was a correlation that the more deficient, it seemed to correlate with more severe symptoms, which makes sense, right? The more anandamide deficient you are, the more excitotoxicity you may have, or neuroexcitation. So if somebody is highly in that category, let's say having severe symptoms, it's quite possible they're more endocannabinoid deficient. This is why having objective lab testing, either receptor status, anandamide levels, that would be extremely helpful to be able to do that. The problem is that if you wanted to do, right now I don't believe really commercially the tests are available commercially, but I expect that I don't know if insurance would cover those tests, and then to add that cost on top of everything. But I do think that we might get to a point where if we could measure this in patients and we have an indication, then maybe we could potentially get insurance to cover an anandamide deficiency. And I always tell people, if you're freaked out by THC, change the name to anandamide replacement.
Great. Lovely. So let's take a step back and talk about plant medicines for a second here, right? Because plant medicines are complex. In fact, what we're doing, whether it's cannabis or other medicinal plants, is we're using the most complex pharmacology there is on the planet. However, it's also evolutionarily proven. That's what we've always known. It wasn't until I heard a number today, 1897, that there were isolates out there that people could take as drugs. Now, with that in mind, isolates have this idea of one drug, one disease, or a single target, right? Now, there's this idea in pharma about dirty drugs, that a drug that hits more than one target is a dirty drug. Now, that tells you everything about the pharma mentality, right? Well, the way medicinal plants work is by biochemical convergence, multiple targets hitting different sites, or one compound hitting multiple targets hitting one site, right? So you've got both of those things going on. So you have this biochemical convergence on an outcome, not necessarily just one receptor, one enzyme. But you've also got pharmacokinetic potentiation from the other compounds in there. Now, a lot of the isolate research, a lot of the research on CBD and some of it on THC has really been based on isolates. So one of the reasons we may be seeing differences in medication, in the dosing with THC, CBD, real world clinic versus research is based on this idea of network pharmacology, that we're treating the body as a network and massaging multiple nodes at once rather than one single target. So with that in mind, let me throw a question out to our panel, and that question would be, in terms of quality control of product and things that are full spectrum, broad spectrum, complete spectrum, and I've heard isolate called full spectrum before, how do you guys as clinicians negotiate the different products and the variability in those products and dose?
Well, I think one thing that Dr. MacCallum pointed out, which I've seen over and over again through the years, and I'm sure Dr. Goldstein has also, is that people do well with variability in their medication. So while the pharmaceutical industry and the medical system likes to really standardize things and keep them consistent from one month to the next, I think there's an advantage in cannabis to having it actually change over time. So that's one comment. And just something I want to repeat that I learned from you, Kevin, is the term full spectrum, I believe, refers to taking the flower and putting it in your mouth. And I don't think that there's any other full spectrum that exists. You can have very close to full spectrum. Yeah. So, thank you for the applause. I think some of you recognize this. Like, we're, as an industry, doing our best to make very broad spectrum medications. A lot of us recognize that as many of those compounds as we can get in there, that's going to be helpful. But let's not call it full spectrum, because that's a misnomer. Let's be honest. I think one of the big problems with the opioid epidemic was this dishonesty about what it could do and how safe it was and what it was. Like, let's not even tiptoe near that with cannabis. Let's be extremely honest and transparent if we can.
Yeah, excellent.
And I mean, another good analogy to that concept and those thoughts on broad spectrum or full spectrum, whatever you'd like to use, is looking at nabilone, for example. I have patients that can't afford cannabis, so sometimes what I do is use nabilone as the THC kind of substitute, so to speak, even though it's not, for sleep at bedtime perhaps, and then CBD in the daytime. And then a number of them, it may not work, or they have very severe side effects, and for some it may last 10 hours or longer, the side effects, which isn't great for a number of my patients, especially when they're elderly. And the lowest dose is 0.25 milligrams, but then when we try cannabis and we do a lower dose, they get response. So I think looking at just THC versus THC and the company it keeps, that's a good example of showing that there is something more to it. And then also something that I know, Dustin, you've spoken about this before, is the idea that you may not always need this medicine. And I can think of one of my professional patients. She's done everything I've ever told her to do. And it's taken us a few years, but right now she doesn't use cannabis. So she was a lawyer. She was very sick. We did everything before cannabis because she wanted to, and she's got kids and very, kind of fixed in the way she was thinking about cannabis. And we actually did make a lot of gains with cannabis. And unfortunately for her, she had to use more THC than she wanted to. She wanted to just do CBD and just do nabilone before that, and very much regimented. And then when she started doing mindfulness courses, learning about nutrition, doing some yoga, so really this neuroplasticity. And she was able to come to classes with the help of the medicine, because before she was bedridden with her chronic fatigue and her fibromyalgia. So it actually got her to a place where she could do the hard work, and actually now she uses very little, if any, like maybe just as needed. So yeah, I think that those are great examples of how it can be really an adjunct and something like your tonic, that analogy you used today. It's very, very helpful.
Great. And I just want to point out something. This idea of plasticity, I think, is really key. And we talk about neuroplasticity a lot, but I'd like to suggest that there's actually a pharmacological or a physiological plasticity. But that would be based on tweaking a lot of different sites, right? A lot of different targets, as we say in pharma, not just taking one isolate. So could it be that, in fact, 5 million years of evolution, right, in terms of putting complex plants in our mouth and chewing them, could that be that is maybe the key way to stimulate the system towards a healing response rather than one isolate? An isolate gives us the illusion of control, but due to inter-individual variability, I'm going to say to you guys, with 80 to 100,000 people dying from properly prescribed medications every year to new to nature drugs, I don't think we have control. Right? So, great commentary. Okay, so another huge one that I'm finding, and in fact, my partner and I, it's interesting to watch the difference between us. Can you speak to gender differences in terms of dosing and effects?
Sure. There's a lot of inter-individual variability, and so it's a big confounder on gender differences because it's hard to tease out. Just every person is so different. But the only clear gender difference that I've observed in my practice has to do with older women who are using opioids and have been on them for a long period of time, and they seem less likely to experience the THC-based opioid potentiation of analgesia. So like most patients that are on opioids, we give them some THC. Once they get up to this dose, the opioids feel too strong and they start breaking them in half. That's many of the patients. But I have had several older women patients on opioids that have not had that response. And even some that aren't on opioids where THC just doesn't seem to work as well as an analgesic, where that therapeutic window that I described before does not exist. And they start getting intolerable psychoactive effects before they experience the analgesia. And that's not all of them. That's far from all of them. That's just a little bit of a trend I've observed.
Yeah, I've got a husband and wife couple similar in age, mid-40s, and he can't tolerate any THC whatsoever. He uses it for anxiety, and his wife has migraines, and she can tolerate, a good dose of THC. And actually, one thing she mentioned to me, she's very much into practicing yoga. She said, well, I drink a full liter of lemon water before I start my day. And so Ethan, I know, writes quite a bit about, lemon and these antidotes and potentially being able to tame THC and the terpenes. So I don't really know if that has to do with her ability to tolerate THC, but he can't tolerate any. So I just feel like it's all over the map. Like it's really hard to tell.
Bonni, Michelle, no commentary?
And I will just comment that some of the data which you showed yesterday, Bonni, out of Israel did show a sex difference response in children with autistic spectrum disorder in Israel, and the boys were more likely to respond to a CBD dominant preparation for severe behaviors in autism. Even though the girls did respond, the boys responded better.
Okay, so another topic to touch on is this idea of microdosing. So I've heard people say they can't stand the idea of this term being used, but we're talking about microdosing with psilocybin now, with DMT, with THC, with CBD, even. In fact, you've seen some data here today that microdosing, if that's what you want to call it, with CBD or THCA. Did you show the THCA data?
I didn't, but it's there.
That this makes a huge difference in outcomes. So I just want to throw the microdosing concept out to you guys.
Well, I think, we don't have to be real strict with our terminology, but it is a bit of a misnomer. I think traditionally microdosing refers to microgram doses of a substance. Now we're using it micro, like there's some normal dosing, and now we're like one level below that. But essentially, I think the way it's being used the most and it's effectively used is to describe typically a dose of THC that does not produce psychoactive effects but still promotes some type of a health benefit, whether that's symptom relief or stress resilience improvement. And that's the microdose. Can we use cannabis in a way that makes us slightly more flexible, maybe a little bit happier or easier to kind of roll with the punches kind of a thing, without getting high, and that's there. And while it's doing that, what else is it doing? Like I mentioned this morning, protecting us should we have a heart attack, a brain injury, liver injury, and so forth. So maybe there's something to that.
I'm just going to make a comment about kind of the world we live in. I notice a lot of the moms that come in with their children eventually kind of reach out for help. Okay, the child's doing better, and now I'm a mess, so can you help me? And many of them will say, I've heard about microdosing, I want to do microdosing. And what I say is, okay, throw that term out. It's just a term you're trying to kind of, I showed a poster of the reefer madness, and it said she was a good girl until she started using reefer or something. I mean, let's get over it, okay? If THC is your medicine, it's your medicine. Whether it's 1 milligram or 100 milligrams, it's your medicine, right? So I think we should treat each other as adults in the room, and if 2.5 milligrams is your dose, you may be saying, oh, I microdose, because you don't want to be seen as a stoner, pothead, whatever, but you know that that dose helps you, and again, treating each other as adults. If you are under the influence, maybe don't drive your car, don't take the kids to school when you're under the influence, or whatever situation you're in that might be risky. But at the same time, I don't think that we in 2019 should be calling something microdosing when it's actually a dose, right?
Well said. Dr. Shuffett, you showed some data showing that elderly people needed a different dose than the young. Would you comment on that? Sorry, I didn't mean to surprise you.
I was just waiting for the specifics of the comment. So I think the primary reason why there's a bit of a difference in general is we tend to approach the elderly patient in a more conservative fashion, and we do start on a lower dose from the beginning because we don't want them to have a bad experience. Similar to some of the questions you were talking about that you ask patients, we try to understand before we prescribe a medication in the pharmacy if the patient has ever tried cannabis before, what exact symptoms or conditions they're trying to deal with, and also what their expectations are and what their lifestyle's like. Because if someone has never used cannabis 50 years ago recreationally and they have no idea what THC feels like, you don't want to give them a higher dose at the beginning and have them have a bad experience and then have them not want to even try it again, because we know it might help them, so we always try to start lower. So I think that's probably a functional reason for why there's differences there. And then ultimately, I think you could look at just simply metabolism in a younger person versus an older person as a reason why the dosing might end up being different in the long run.
I just want to add one more comment that came to mind as well, is my patients really want to please me, even though I tell them. I say, please, just tell me what's going on. It doesn't matter. And so they tell me that they're ordering what I've recommended. But a lot of them, what I've come to realize, especially on Twitter, I've been asking some polls of people like, how do you use it? What do you use? And then I chose a question. I said, well, how much more would you use if you had no barriers and if money wasn't an issue? And I realized like more than 50% needed 50% more than what they were using. So I also want to mention that the doses we're talking about here, unless it's a clinical trial or an observational study where it's been given like what they need, or if they're allowed to go higher, they do. Sometimes they're really hoarding and stretching their supply. So just to say that.
I wanted to ask you if that data was from New York exclusively, and so I know the economics of medical cannabis in New York are somewhat restrictive for patients. Do you have any idea if your customers are shopping outside of your stores for CBD?
For just like a full CBD?
Like, are they using hemp CBD to cut their total cost down?
We don't really ask about that in our surveys, so I don't have a factual data set that would tell us that, but I think a lot of people are starting to add that in to kind of give a boost from the perspective of the total cannabinoid dose, but I don't have anything specific there.
I think a lot of us were surprised at just how low the milligrams of CBD were. Not that that's an ineffective dose, but I would think the median might be a little bit higher.
Perhaps that whole idea of the plant, because it is more than CBD in there.
There you go.
There are other minor cannabinoids in the products that we provide. We don't necessarily spell out the exact milligrams of those, but there are 10 different minor cannabinoids in the product formulations.
If you will permit the word microdosing, what I would say is if you're taking a hemp product that is not THC free, you are microdosing THC. And so there's definitely probably an effect from the CBD as well as the THC there.
And even Epidiolex, the FDA-approved CBD, does have some THC in it at about 0.5 milligram per milliliter.
Yeah, now, Dr. MacCallum brought up a really good point, and that is honesty between a clinician and a patient. When I was doing clinical work, I used to use a psychological trick with people. It sounds horrible, psychological trick. That is the, no. So one of the things that I used to do is if I asked them to take something twice a day, a medicinal plant preparation twice a day, I would say to them on the follow-up, I would say, so how's it going with your herbs? And they'd say, fine. And then I'd say, so are you getting that once a day? And because I had told them to take it twice a day, I'd just given them permission to tell me the truth. Because some of them looked at me like, no, you said to take it twice a day. Well, I'm getting it sometimes twice a day. So I could actually really crack that. I could get the truth from it. So that can actually be really super helpful. We're coming to a close here. We've got about 5 minutes. So I'm going to give each of you the opportunity to, I guess you've got 1 minute, each of you the opportunity to put your take on dosing in a couple sentences.
Well, Caroline pointed it out, so I'll just emphasize it, that self-awareness is part of cannabis dosing. It's really important to check in and see how you responded to that dose, write it down, and then figure that out. This is embedded into all my free patient education dosing programs on healer.com, something called the inner inventory, and I think we have 30 seconds left, so I'll tell you how to do it, but you might not have time to check it right now, or maybe so. You take a deep breath, you see how smooth and easy it is, you rate that on a scale from 1 to 10. 10 is super smooth and easy, 1 is tight, hard to breathe. Then you take a few moments to just sit or stand, let your body remain still, and you rate on a scale from 1 to 10, how easy is it for you to remain still? How comfortable are you? And then you put a fake smile on your face, give it a few seconds, and see how real that can become, or just check in with yourself and see how authentically content you feel on a scale from 1 to 10. Those 3 numbers written down before and after you use cannabis each time, and then you can look back at that as a trend, will tell you a lot about if you're getting the dosing right.
Beautiful.
Can I just say what he said? No. Okay, so what I think would be most helpful is I often tell my patients, please, please, please track and log what products you're using. If you throw the package away, before you throw it away, write down what it says on the label. Try to remember, because you may try 5 different products and say, you know what, that first one was the one I really liked, and oh shoot, I can't remember what brand it was, and I've had situations where I've had patients use something that they really liked, and then they went back and it wasn't there, so they tried a few other things, and then they don't remember. So for one particular patient, we have tried so many things, and she cannot remember the name of and what it was and so on. So I do encourage people to journal. There are online, you can buy, if you want to write things down, you can buy medical, they actually have cannabis journals that, ask you what's the product, and they give you space to put the CBD, THC. There's also apps where you can put your information in. Or if you want to go, cheap and easy, go to the drugstore and buy a notebook and just put the date down and put down the products you're using. I think journaling is huge to be able to narrow in on what helps you the most.
Dr. Shuffett, I'm sorry, you've got 45 seconds.
I'll be quick. I think the most important thing about dosing is managing expectations for a patient, because one of the most fascinating things about medical cannabis is that one person's benefit is another person's side effect. So you really have to help them understand what they might feel if it's not what they're expecting to treat. If I take something for sleep and I get the euphoria or the good feelings, I'm going to be surprised. So have a really honest conversation about what to expect.
Okay, so we've just said a lot of the points I would make, but education is key. Having frequent check-ins and monitoring I find very helpful, and making changes. So if you are using oils, try vaporization and vice versa. Maybe it's CBD, maybe it's THC, maybe it's THCA, trying other products. And one thing we haven't really talked about is recreational use, and I really do recommend the exact same things for recreation. Well, that would be what I would recommend. I don't see a lot of patients for recreational purposes, but I think that especially in Canada, we're changing the packaging come this fall in terms of what's going to be available, is using a logical approach, because if the full package of gummy bears is 1,000 milligrams, people may take 1,000 and think that that's what the dose is. So really, again, would be a mindful approach to recreational use as well.
So
please, to all the product makers here, it's okay if you label the total content per bottle, but put something a little more specific around an actual dosage. It's very helpful for patients. Milligrams per milliliter, milligrams per dose, whatever. Per piece, whatever.
So I'd just like to close and say, to me, this was extremely valuable because you've got it from in the trenches here. And speaking of the trenches, I want to take my hat off and give these guys a huge applause. These are medical warriors. Thank you for what you do.